The Wicker Man is a 1973 British horror film. I'll get to that in a bit. Directed by Robin Hardy and is based upon the 1967 horror novel Ritual, written by David Pinner. It follows the story of a British detective, Howie, played by Edward Woodward, who goes to the island of Summerisle, led by Christopher Lee, Lord Summerisle, where he encounters the strange happenings of a pagan cult, let's just say. I don't want to reveal too much about the movie because I feel like the mystery works quite well. But if you've heard of The Wicker Man, you probably know enough about this film to put the pieces together. But a lot of you probably haven't heard of The Wicker Man, and unfortunately, because of that, a lot of people probably didn't even click on this video because they didn't even know about this film. And today, I'm going to try to convince you that The Wicker Man is possibly the most underrated horror film of all time, in my humble opinion. Being someone who has watched hundreds and hundreds of horror movies, I've seen my fair share. And usually when you think of the best horror films of all time, what usually comes to mind? Halloween, Psycho, The Shining, The Exorcist. Even a movie like Rosemary's Baby, while maybe not as well known, still has its fan base. But The Wicker Man usually is pretty underrated. No one talks about this movie. And because today is May 1st, celebrating May Day, according to the lore of The Wicker Man, I wanted to celebrate this movie. It's a film that I just recently saw while being stuck in quarantine, and it blew me away, honestly. So you probably know about the 2006 Wicker Man with esteemed actor Nicolas Cage.
This is murder! Murder! You'll all be guilty! And you're doing it for nothing!
What a gem of a guy. I love Nicolas Cage, but he can make some goofy movies, and the 2006 Wicker Man is a prime example of schlock movies. And unfortunately, I feel like the reputation for this film is based upon the remake. No one seems to think about the original. The 1973 film is the very definition of slow burn atmospheric horror. If you are into the fast-paced jump scare horror movies like The Nun or the Annabelle series, this isn't the horror film for you. But if you're into the slow burn horror, with films like The Exorcist being a great example of one such movie, you will enjoy the heck out of The Wicker Man. And the reason that I put air quotes around horror is because a lot of people don't even consider this film horror. The last scene is most certainly horrific, but most people consider this maybe a dark thriller. But I have to say, this movie is definitely a horror film. There are so many elements that make it a horror film, from the slow burn to some of the effects used in the movie, the pacing, the masks, especially the ending. This is a horror film and based upon a horror novel. It's a British film, so a lot of American audiences may not be familiar with it. The only thing that might draw an outside viewer into this movie is the performance of Christopher Lee, whom, by the way, said that this was his favorite movie that he was ever in. And Edward Woodward, who stars in this film, said that the character of Sergeant Howie is his favorite character that he's ever played. This movie is fantastic. Basically, the plot is Howie travels to this island in search of a young girl named Rowan Morrison. He believes that she has been kidnapped, murdered, or is in extreme danger. He tries to ask the local people on the island of Summerisle where she is, and no one gives him a clear answer. He goes to her school, he goes to her family, and he begins to piece together a narrative that Rowan Morrison may be sacrificed in a cultish ritual sacrifice by the pagan cult on the island. He tries to visit Lord Summerisle, again played just fantastically by Christopher Lee. Christopher Lee's always a treat in any movie he's in. But he goes to visit Summerisle and asks him about their traditions on the island, to which he gets some pretty intense responses. Howie is a devout Catholic, and coming to the island where they do not believe in the Catholic faith, it really clashes with his culture and leads to some really dramatic scenes, especially in the climactic ending, where there's a major plot twist revealed, which I don't want to spoil for you quite yet in case you don't want it spoiled, because it's great. And one of the most terrifying scenes in movie history occurs within the last 15 minutes or so of The Wicker Man, with the titular Wicker Man. Because when most people think about this movie, they think about just that, the large wooden man, which I don't want to spoil what he's being used for. He's only in the movie for the last, 5 or 10 minutes, but the impact it leaves is so monumental. This story is essentially the tale of two cultures clashing. The more Americanized Catholic culture, or really the British culture, but we here in the States kind of put it in this American mentality. But even for the Brits, this culture of Catholicism and Christianity coming into a pagan, island setting, it clashes and it creates some really interesting drama that hasn't been seen on screen before. A few years ago, Ari Aster made a film called Midsummer, which I thought was a very mix-matched film, but it had a nice, creepy atmosphere to it. But a lot of that is taken from this movie, The Wicker Man. And the reason that movie did not work as well as The Wicker Man does is because The Wicker Man isn't playing out like a horror film. Nothing is intentionally trying to scare you. It's all just playing as it normally would. People aren't acting malicious, they're not acting creepy or evil, they're just acting normal. And the things that they find normal are unnerving, especially from someone in a different culture, especially the implications of the things they're doing. And in movies like Midsummer and many other cult films, they push the cult factor up so much where they act purposely unnerving, where any logical person would just flee the island. In this film, you begin to relate to Howie. You think maybe because he's a cop that he can get through this, he has authority on the island, when really he's kind of in the palm of the Summerisle's hand, if you will, the Wicker Man's hand, and his fate was determined long before he even arrived. Again, not trying to spoil the ending. I'll get to a spoiler section in just a bit, but I just wanted to emphasize the impact that The Wicker Man had on me. It is now one of my favorite horror films, and it's a movie that unfortunately is underrated nowadays. Is it a slow burner? Yes, absolutely. And if you want the heart-pumping horror and jump scares and loud things in your face, you're not going to get it in The Wicker Man. But if you want a movie that's going to tense you, creep you out the entire time, and leave you at the end with your mouth agape, The Wicker Man will do just that and more. Besides just the incredible performances and the great story, the cinematography is really interesting. It's very artistic, it's very skewed, and I really dig it. And the soundtrack is so deep. There are so many great tracks in this song, from Willow's song to the Maypole song, the very beginning and the ending themes are fantastic.
In the woods there grew a tree, and a fine, fine tree was he. And on that tree there was a limb, and on that limb there was a branch, and on that branch there was a nest, and in that nest there was an egg, and in that egg there was a bird, and from that bird a feather came, and of that feather was a bed.
I believe the composer's name was Paul Giovanni or something like that. I probably butchered the composer's name, but incredible job by him. And this movie is almost like a musical in ways, because the pagan traditions rely a lot on music, but it really goes to show how devout some people will go in their faith, and sometimes when it's life or death, they choose things that are radical and can result in the worst. So, with all of that said, before I get to the spoilers, giving my ranking of The Wicker Man, it gets a 5 out of 5 skulls on the R.I.P. Reviews rating scale. Go watch The Wicker Man. At the time of this recording, The Wicker Man is available on Netflix. It's about an hour and 20 so minutes, so it's not a terribly long film, and I recommend you go check it out. Now, if you're interested, we're going to get into the spoilers.
I'd like my supper now, please.
It won't be long, Sergeant. Oh, you don't want to let them worry you. Why don't you have a wee drink?
No, thank you, not just now.
So, Sergeant Howie arrives on the island of Summerisle in search of Rowan Morrison, whom he thinks is kidnapped and is going to be used for a ritual sacrifice. What he doesn't know is that she is just the bait, and Sergeant Howie is actually the sacrifice, because he fits all the qualifications. He comes from the king, he is a fool, he is a virgin, he is all of these things that the people are looking for a sacrifice. The reason they want to sacrifice Howie is because they want their crops to blossom. They believe that their apples and their fruits were not being harvested correctly and were not growing properly because they did not offer a sacrifice to their pagan gods of the fields and of nature. And Sergeant Howie tries to convince them that they're just crazy, that there is no sun god or god of the field, and that there is only the God Jesus, that there is only the Christian God, and they do not listen to him. And they are so devout in their faith that they take Sergeant Howie to the Wicker Man, this huge statue of a man made out of wood, filled with animals. They put him in it and let it burn. And he's just left in there to burn alive as they sing their harvest summer song. And it's so creepy and unnerving. And, of course I'm going to have my bias. I've grown up in a Christian household. I view myself as a pretty, religious person in some senses. And when you take a look at Sergeant Howie's perspective as a Catholic, as a Christian, against this huge group of pagan people, it's intimidating, especially at the end where he's looking up and all of the people in masks just kind of approach him. It's quite a sight to behold, and it makes you put your own ethics and faith into perspective. Like, how far would someone go in their faith, even taking an innocent person to the grave to make your crops blossom, so to speak? So I thought in terms of a message, it was great. And in terms of a horror movie, it was utterly fantastic. I think the last scene of this movie easily could fall into the top 5 best horror scenes of all time. Iconically up there with like the Psycho shower scene or the Exorcist, head spinning scene. Unfortunately, like I mentioned previously in this review, The Wicker Man isn't a film that time has been kind to, which is sad because it really is a great horror classic, in my humble opinion. But I want to ask you, have you seen The Wicker Man? Have you seen the remake? What do you think about this movie? Because it's not talked about very often. Leave a comment below, and if you've never seen it, be honest, and I hope you'll be able to check it out, as it is currently streaming right now. Thank you for watching, and remember, as always, for all things Halloween, this is Hauntformer.